Stand down immediately. That's an order.
The American military officer, Captain Reynolds, snaps, his tone sharp and commanding. His hand hovers over his rifle, a weapon born from years of training in combat zones far from here. Across from him, Guard Sergeant Blake doesn't even blink. He stands, perfectly still, like a stone monument. Not a twitch, not a flinch.
For a moment, the world holds its breath, but when Blake finally speaks, it's not in anger, and it's not with fear.
His words come slowly, almost gently, yet they carry the weight of centuries. Sir, you may be used to giving orders, but here, my duty isn't to obey, it's to endure.
In the heart of London's history, amid the timeless stone of the tower, where centuries of royal history are whispered in the wind, two worlds are about to collide.
One, grounded in the rigor and might of the US military, where every step is measured, every action calculated for a fight that could be anywhere, at any time. The other, steeped in centuries of tradition, discipline, and honor, a world where the very art of standing still could be the most powerful act of all. The officer, Captain Reynolds, a seasoned military man, trained in the chaos of modern warfare, finds himself questioning something that seems on the surface almost unnecessary. The strict, almost robotic discipline of a Royal Guard. Blake, the guard standing in front of him, the figure representing 400 years of royal history, doesn't flinch, doesn't even blink.
But why? Why does Sergeant Blake stand so motionless, even as the world around him grows more chaotic? Why does he stay still, when every part of Reynolds' military instincts is screaming at him to move, to react, to confront?
It's this very question that draws Reynolds into a world he never thought he'd understand. A world where strength isn't always loud, where power isn't defined by speed, but by resilience. A world where the true strength of a soldier can be found not in their ability to react, but in their ability to endure. And as we dive deeper into this story, I invite you to think about this. What if the greatest strength is not in rushing to act, but in standing firm when the world expects you to move?
What can we, in our everyday lives, learn from this quiet but unshakable discipline?
Before we explore further, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss the rest of this incredible story.
Trust me, you'll want to hear what happens next.
Now, let's step back and look at where it all began. The world of the Royal Guards.
And the philosophy that makes them stronger than you might think. The courtyard of the Tower of London is always a place of quiet reverence.
Visitors from all over the world gather to witness the grandeur of British history, standing in awe of the stoic figures who guard this iconic fortress. But on that particular afternoon, something different was unfolding. Captain Reynolds, a seasoned US officer with years of military experience, was not here to admire history, he was here to assess it. He had spent countless hours training troops in the field, facing everything from the heat of desert battles to the cold, calculated maneuvers of modern warfare.
He was no stranger to high-stakes situations, and his training was all about reacting swiftly, thinking on his feet, adapting to the ever-changing dynamics of the battlefield.
But as he walked through the courtyard, his eyes locked onto the figure of Sergeant Blake, the Royal Guard standing at his post.
There, in full ceremonial uniform, stood the guard, unwavering and silent, completely still in the face of everything happening around him.
No movement, not a twitch, not a blink.
And yet, Captain Reynolds couldn't help but feel a flicker of frustration. This wasn't how it was done in his world. In his world, the ability to adapt, to react quickly, was everything. So when he gave his command, stand down immediately, that's an order. He expected action, a swift response, a sign of cooperation, perhaps even a slight acknowledgement. But instead, there was nothing, just silence.
Sergeant Blake's posture was perfect, almost mechanical in its stillness.
But it was a stillness that commanded respect. It was the kind of discipline that spoke volumes without uttering a single word. And yet, it confounded Reynolds.
The officer took a step forward, closer now, his frustration mounting.
He reached out, hand hovering near Blake's ceremonial rifle. This wasn't just about military protocols anymore, it was about his pride, his authority, his need to see this soldier follow the established order. And then, something happened that Reynolds wasn't prepared for. Sergeant Blake's voice, calm and measured, cut through the tension. I don't move until I'm told. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't disrespect. It was simply the truth. Sergeant Blake wasn't a machine.
He wasn't just there to stand still.
He was there to hold his ground, no matter what. The Royal Guard's job wasn't simply to be present, it was to be unwavering in the face of whatever challenges might arise. And in that moment, Blake's stillness wasn't a weakness, it was his strength.
Reynolds stood frozen, not in anger, but in a mix of confusion and awe.
He had just witnessed something he hadn't anticipated, a different kind of power.
A power that didn't come from the ability to react, but from the strength to endure.
And while that standoff may have seemed like a simple moment of tension, it was only the beginning of a larger journey.
One that would explore not just the discipline of Sergeant Blake, but the philosophy behind it. The values that define not only the Royal Guard, but every soldier who takes an oath to protect something bigger than themselves.
As we continue, let's take a deeper look into why the Royal Guard's role is more than just ceremonial. It's a crucial part of a larger, highly integrated security system that can teach us all a lesson about staying grounded, no matter the circumstances.
The afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the courtyard as the tension between Captain Reynolds and Sergeant Blake began to settle.
But as Reynolds stood there, still processing the unexpected stillness of the Royal Guard, something else began to unfold in the distance, a demonstration of military tactics that would blur the lines between tradition and modern combat. In the far corner of the courtyard, a small group of US soldiers under the direction of Reynolds began to set up tactical equipment. They were preparing to run through a smoke drill, one that mimicked the kind of urban warfare simulations often used in training. The smoke generators hummed to life, releasing puffs of dense white fog into the air, simulating a breach in security, a distraction, a surprise move designed to test readiness.
Captain Reynolds moved through the team, ensuring everything was in place.
He looked over at Sergeant Blake, still standing motionless at his post, unwavering.
The contrast was striking. Here was Reynolds, preparing for a high-octane drill, focused on rapid response and calculated reactions. And yet, right beside him stood Blake, embodying the essence of stillness and calm in the midst of chaos.
"Your guard hasn't moved an inch," Reynolds muttered to one of his officers, almost in disbelief. "How is this useful in a real security breach scenario?"
The officer glanced at Blake, who remained unfazed by the approaching smoke, the sounds of soldiers coordinating movements, and the mounting tension of the drill. "It's not just about what he does now," the officer replied quietly.
"It's about the position he holds, the command he represents, and the calm he brings to the situation."
Reynolds wasn't sure he understood. To him, the smoke, the drills, the tactics, it was all about adapting to the unpredictable, adjusting in the heat of the moment, and responding with speed. But Blake's stillness wasn't just about enduring, it was about mastering the art of presence, of standing firm, even when the world around you was in chaos.
Suddenly, the smoke thickened, and the sound of soldiers moved with calculated precision through the fog. It wasn't long before Reynolds and his team had created the perfect scenario, a simulated breach, designed to test the security personnel at the tower.
But as the smoke swirled and the drills intensified, Reynolds couldn't help but notice something. Even in the midst of the commotion, Blake remained steadfast, his posture unchanged, his focus unbroken. It was as if the smoke wasn't there.
As if the chaos unfolding around him couldn't touch him.
He wasn't just a ceremonial figure, he was a point of stability in a world where instability often ruled.
It was then that Reynolds had his first real realization.
The Royal Guard wasn't about stationary poses or routine drills.
It was about being a constant in a fluctuating world.
Blake wasn't just holding a position, he was maintaining a posture that was meant to withstand anything.
That steady presence was what grounded the people around him. His role wasn't just symbolic.
It was deeply operational.
Just then, a senior officer from the British security team stepped forward, his voice cutting through the fog. "We've initiated the final phase of the drill.
Smoke is in play.
Let's move to secondary positions." Reynolds raised an eyebrow. The British security officers, trained in a very different way, had responded quickly, without hesitation. And here, in the midst of smoke, drills, and tactical maneuvers, was Blake, the very embodiment of tradition, standing firm, silently ensuring that the chaotic simulation didn't disrupt the flow of operations.
There was an unspoken message in that silence, a lesson that Reynolds was just beginning to grasp.
In the face of modern combat tactics, the Royal Guard maintained something more powerful, a presence that fostered order even amidst disorder. Blake wasn't just performing a ceremonial duty, he was part of an integrated security framework that allowed the system to function with unparalleled efficiency.
Reynolds felt the weight of that understanding.
The drills, the smoke, the loud sounds of simulated chaos, none of it had shaken Blake.
In fact, the very stillness of the guard had brought a level of clarity that Reynolds hadn't expected.
The Royal Guard's discipline wasn't a limitation in this environment, it was an asset.
As Reynolds stood there, processing this new perspective, a thought began to take shape.
The role of the Royal Guard, once seen merely as a ceremonial duty, was proving to be far more than that.
But how exactly did these guards integrate with the broader security system?
How did their presence translate into actual protection? In the next part, we'll take a deeper dive into the tactical advantage of this integration, exploring how the Royal Guard's methods intersect with modern security systems, creating a seamless approach that's not just about standing still, but about being strategically adaptive when it counts. The smoke from the drill still lingered in the air as Captain Reynolds watched Sergeant Blake, who stood unmoved, his posture still as strong and unwavering as it had been hours ago.
It was as if time itself had stood still around Blake, and nothing, not the rising tension, not the loud commands, nor the simulated chaos could break his focus.
Reynolds couldn't help but feel a deep sense of respect for the man. Blake's discipline was not just about standing still, it was about something far deeper. There was an unbreakable code behind his every move, a set of principles so deeply ingrained in him that no force could alter his stance, no matter what was happening around him. It was the same code that had been passed down through generations of guards, tested and refined over centuries.
This wasn't just about tradition for tradition's sake.
It was about resilience, about training the mind and body to withstand the kind of external pressure most of us could never imagine. Reynolds was beginning to understand that the Royal Guard's discipline wasn't a passive feature of their job. It was an active form of mental toughness. Sergeant Blake's discipline came from years of training, but not just any training that required him to endure extreme levels of stress. There were stories of guards standing in the pouring rain, feeling the weight of countless eyes watching them, yet not flinching.
There were countless drills where guards would go without rest, constantly on alert, but never allowing the fatigue to show.
It was all a part of their training to create a mental and physical fortress, one that could stand tall against any storm, both literal and metaphorical. Blake's discipline was a way of life, a constant practice of control over his own body and mind. The guards' ability to maintain composure was what set them apart. But what Reynolds hadn't realized until that moment was that it wasn't just the physical endurance that mattered, it was the mental fortitude, the ability to choose stillness, to act with purpose even when the world around you was in motion. Captain, one of his officers called out, snapping Reynolds from his thoughts.
We've finished the drills. We're ready for the next stage. Reynolds looked over at Blake again.
The guard was still unmoving. What drives him?
He wondered aloud, not expecting an answer. The officer, sensing the question in his tone, replied, "It's the code they follow, the same code that's been with them for centuries."
A code of unwavering discipline and focus.
Blake doesn't just stand there for the show, Captain.
He's embodying something much bigger, something that demands absolute control over mind and body. Reynolds turned towards the officer, his curiosity piqued. So, it's not just about looking tough, it's about mental strength. The officer nodded. Exactly. It's about knowing your purpose and committing to it without hesitation, even in the face of adversity. Even when the world tries to knock you off course. Blake's discipline isn't just for ceremony, it's a lifestyle.
Reynolds thought back to the chaos of the drill, the noise, the smoke, the tactical maneuvers.
Here he was, leading a team trained to react instantly, to move with precision. But Blake, in his stillness, had something Reynolds didn't: unshakable clarity. In the whirlwind of action, Blake was the rock holding steady in the storm. The lesson was clear. Discipline isn't just about rigid routines or adherence to rules. It's about the ability to remain calm in the chaos, to stay focused when others are lost in the moment. It's the kind of discipline that keeps you from breaking, no matter the pressure.
Reynolds felt a new respect for the Royal Guard. They weren't just ceremonial figures.
They were the epitome of mental discipline, a living example of control in a world that demanded anything but ... As Reynolds stood there, absorbing the weight of Blake's relentless discipline, he couldn't help but wonder how this mindset could be applied beyond the guard's post. How could Blake's unwavering focus influence the way soldiers in combat respond to uncertainty and pressure? The next chapter in our story will explore just that, how mental discipline can be transferred to the battlefield, where decisions must be made quickly, and the cost of hesitation can be catastrophic. How does a Royal Guard's training, built on centuries of discipline, hold up when faced with the urgency of combat? The answers may surprise you.
As the sun began to set over the Tower of London, casting long shadows across the ancient stone walls, Captain Reynolds found himself reflecting on something deeper, something that had been weighing on his mind ever since his interaction with Sergeant Blake. The Royal Guard, in all their ceremonial grandeur, were often seen as just that, a grand spectacle, a show for the tourists, a symbol of tradition.
But what Reynolds hadn't fully realized, what many didn't understand, was the real reason they were there.
It wasn't just about the uniform, the rifle, or the unyielding stance. It was about security, and not the kind that came from high-tech gadgets or reinforced walls. This was about a centuries-old system designed to protect not just a palace, but the very heart of British history.
Sergeant Blake, standing so still in his ceremonial position, was more than just a guardian of the gates. He was part of something much bigger.
The real security system at the tower wasn't in the form of cameras, alarm systems, or armed guards behind the scenes. It was in the tradition, the protocol, the system of vigilance that had been honed over generations.
Every movement, every glance, every shift in posture was part of a carefully calculated response to potential threats.
Captain Reynolds had seen the guards perform their drills with military precision, but there was more to it than that. The Royal Guard's security system went beyond mere physical presence.
It was about creating an atmosphere of control, a sense that no one could ever get close without being noticed.
The guards were always alert, their senses heightened. Their training went far beyond learning to march in sync or hold their rifles steadily.
It was about reading the crowd, anticipating movements, detecting signs of unrest or hostility. The power of their presence alone often served as the most effective deterrent. A crowd may not realize it, but every Royal Guard was a trained observer, constantly scanning the environment, looking for anything that seemed out of place.
One quiet morning, Captain Reynolds had witnessed this firsthand.
He had been standing on the tower grounds, just observing, when a tourist approached one of the guards. The tourist, not realizing the gravity of the situation, stepped too close, and the guard's gaze shifted slightly. His hand moved ever so slightly toward his rifle, just a subtle change, but enough to send a clear message. The tourist immediately backed off, sensing the unspoken warning.
There were no loud commands, no alarms blaring, just the calm, focused intensity of a man who knew exactly what to do if the situation escalated.
It wasn't the power of brute force that kept the tower secure, it was the precision, the attention to detail, and most importantly, the psychological impact the guards had on any would-be threats.
They embodied the spirit of their mission, to stand as a symbol of unshakable resolve.
By simply existing in their role, they created an invisible barrier around the tower that many never even saw, but which made the difference between a peaceful day and a crisis.
But Captain Reynolds also saw something else that day, a lesson that echoed in his mind.
It wasn't just about standing watch. It was about anticipation and calm decision-making in the face of uncertainty.
Security, whether in the context of a royal palace or on the battlefield, is built not just on the tools you have, but on the awareness and presence of mind to use those tools effectively.
The lesson, Reynolds thought, was simple. Vigilance is more than just preparedness.
It is the ability to see danger before it even becomes visible.
And in the case of the Royal Guard, this skill had been honed to perfection over centuries of practice. They didn't wait for threats to show themselves, they actively anticipated them. Their every action designed to prevent danger before it even had a chance to take root.
As Reynolds stood there, thinking about the quiet vigilance of the guards, he couldn't help but wonder, how did their focus, their dedication to security, translate to moments of crisis? How did they respond when things didn't go according to plan, when a threat was real and immediate? How did the mental discipline of Sergeant Blake and his comrades hold up when lives were at stake?
The next chapter explores this very question. What happens when the calm and controlled world of ceremonial duty collides with the chaos of real combat? The answers might just surprise you, and it's a shift in mindset that could change everything for Reynolds and for anyone who faces danger head-on.
As Captain Reynolds reflected on the Royal Guard's unwavering focus, his thoughts inevitably drifted to a comparison between two worlds. The calm, disciplined precision of British military training and the high-energy, aggressive tactics that had come to define much of American combat strategy. Two completely different approaches to the same goal: security, protection, and victory, and yet they both shared a common thread: strength under pressure.
The British way, personified by Sergeant Blake, was about control. It was about thinking ahead, anticipating every move, and staying in complete command of one's emotions. British discipline wasn't flashy, it wasn't about showing of strength or swaggering through a fight.
It was about the ability to stand your ground, regardless of the noise or the chaos swirling around you. It was about mental fortitude, something that took years, even decades, to master.
This discipline was rooted in centuries of tradition, where patience and steadiness were the foundation of military strength. On the other hand, the American military approach had long been characterized by aggression and action. In the heat of battle, American soldiers often relied on quick decisions, bold moves, and forceful execution. There was an immediacy to their actions, a readiness to take charge, sometimes without waiting for the perfect moment. Aggression, in this case, wasn't about recklessness. It was about momentum, the drive to push forward, and never letting the enemy take the upper hand. But what happened when these two worlds collided?
Captain Reynolds didn't have to look far to see the contrast.
He recalled a particular training exercise, one that had brought together British and American soldiers for joint operation.
The mission was straightforward: defend a critical location against an incoming threat.
But what unfolded was a fascinating clash of strategies. As the exercise began, the British soldiers, including Sergeant Blake, took up their positions with measured precision. They checked their equipment, secured their surroundings, and waited. They were fully aware of the danger, but they didn't rush.
They observed, looking for any signs of movement, of potential threats.
They were ready, but they were calm. Every step was calculated.
Meanwhile, the American soldiers, on the other hand, immediately jumped into action.
There was no hesitation. They moved quickly, setting up perimeters, checking corners, and most notably, staying aggressive in their posture.
They weren't just reacting, they were taking control of the situation, pushing forward, making sure the threat never even had a chance to develop. At first, Captain Reynolds thought the Americans might have an advantage.
After all, they were quick and decisive. But as the exercise wore on, he noticed something.
The American soldiers were burning through energy at a rapid pace, their movements becoming more frantic and less strategic.
They were still powerful, but they were beginning to lose the calm focus that had made them so effective in the beginning. Meanwhile, the British soldiers, though quiet, remained completely in control, their disciplined approach allowing them to stay grounded while the Americans grew increasingly agitated. The lesson was clear. Aggression, while powerful, needed to be tempered with discipline. Without control, that initial burst of energy could quickly fade into chaos.
Discipline, on the other hand, allowed one to sustain focus and energy over the long term, staying effective, even when things didn't go as planned.
It was the old adage that Reynolds had heard so many times. Slow is smooth, smooth is fast. The American aggression, if not carefully channeled, could become overwhelming and unwieldy.
But British discipline, if too rigid, could become slow and unresponsive in the face of sudden aggressive threats.
And this was the challenge that Captain Reynolds would have to reconcile as he faced the very real possibility of a real confrontation. Could the British focus on control and restraint withstand the frenetic energy of an adversary who operated at full throttle? Could the disciplined mindset of Sergeant Blake and his comrades hold firm against an opponent who seemed intent on bulldozing their way through any obstacle? The collision of these two worlds, the controlled discipline of the British Guard and the bold aggression of the American military, wasn't just a matter of training. It was a clash of worldviews, each effective in its own right, but each requiring a deep understanding of the other. What Reynolds came to realize was that, sometimes, the key to success was not in choosing one approach over the other, but in understanding when and how to use both.
As Reynolds pondered this, he couldn't help but wonder, what happens when these two approaches aren't just side by side, but face to face in a real-life crisis?
How would Sergeant Blake's calm resolve hold up against an adversary who didn't follow the same rules? Someone who believed in taking bold risks and moving fast. The next chapter dives deeper into what happens when real threats arise, when strategies fail, and the only thing that matters is the decision in the moment.
What would Sergeant Blake do when the pressure was at its highest?
Would his discipline be enough to overcome the chaos, or would this situation require something more? Standing still, unmoving, as the world churns around you, that is the essence of discipline.
It's not just about following orders or standing at attention for hours on end.
It's about something much deeper. The ability to resist the pull of distractions, the urge to react, the internal voice that says, "This is enough, you've done enough, take a break." For someone like Sergeant Blake, this is the reality every single day. Discipline, as Blake embodied it, wasn't just a military skill, it was a way of life. And the cost of maintaining that discipline wasn't something easily understood by those on the outside. While many could admire it from a distance, few truly grasped the mental and emotional toll that came with it. Imagine this every day, as Blake stood there at his post, not moving an inch. He wasn't just waiting, he was enduring. The sheer act of resisting the urge to react to the environment around him took incredible mental strength. It wasn't easy.
The world was in motion. Visitors, tourists, noise, and distractions, all things designed to break his focus, to test his resolve.
And yet, he remained. This wasn't just about standing still. It was about standing strong. No matter how tired he was, no matter how intense the pressure, Blake never allowed his gaze to waver. The cost was high. Every second of that stillness was a battle against his own instincts. To stand unflinching meant embracing sacrifice. Sacrifice of comfort. Sacrifice of personal desire. Sacrifice of any distraction that could pull him away from his mission. And in the world of the Royal Guard, there were no breaks, no moments to pause and reflect. The sacrifice was constant. The discipline needed to maintain this kind of focus came at a high price, one that few could truly understand. It demanded mental fortitude, something that was built over years, shaped by routine and reinforced by a deep sense of responsibility.
But even then, discipline wasn't automatic.
Even the most disciplined minds were tested. There were days when Blake's resolve was stretched to the breaking point, days when the weight of responsibility felt unbearable. But that was the cost of standing firm, of holding that line when everyone else was content to let it slip. Let me give you a real-world example, one that truly highlights this cost. Imagine a soldier, much like Sergeant Blake, deployed to a foreign land, away from family and friends, facing the constant threat of danger.
For months, this soldier stands vigilant, day in and day out, protecting their comrades and their mission.
But what do we often forget?
The toll on their mind. Yes, they might return home, but the sacrifices they made aren't always visible to the eye.
They've given up moments of peace, the freedom to simply relax without worry.
They've given up time with loved ones, and in many ways, they've sacrificed parts of themselves, parts that they might never fully get back.
And yet, they continue.
They remain standing, not because it's easy, not because they feel invincible, but because they know the importance of their duty. It is the quiet strength of discipline that allows them to endure, to push through the hard days, to weather the storms when it seems like everything is pulling them in different directions.
For Blake, this was just another day at the tower. It wasn't about the uniform or the ceremony, it was about purpose.
The quiet resolve that sustained him wasn't driven by a need for recognition or applause.
It came from within. And this, my friends, is a lesson we can all take to heart. Discipline isn't just about what you do, it's about who you become in the process. The cost of discipline is high, but the reward is immeasurable. In the face of adversity, it is the disciplined individual who can stand tall, unwavering, and unflinching.
And that's what made Sergeant Blake's character so unique. He understood the price and was willing to pay it.
That's where the real story begins, when the unbreakable resolve of Sergeant Blake meets its true challenge.
Stay with me, because we're about to dive into the final test of his discipline. Up until now, Captain Reynolds had only seen what was on the surface: the stillness of the Royal Guard, the unflinching stance, the seemingly cold, unmovable figure of Sergeant Blake.
He had interpreted this discipline as rigidity, as a refusal to engage with the world around him.
But in that tense moment, when he stood face to face with Blake, something shifted in Reynolds' mind.
The turning point came not when Blake spoke, but when Reynolds really listened.
It was a small moment, almost imperceptible, but one that marked a change. Captain Reynolds, with all his military experience, had approached the situation with one lens, a view shaped by the aggressive, fast-paced world of combat.
In this world, action was paramount.
Responding quickly, acting decisively, and adapting to ever-changing environments were the pillars of survival.
For Reynolds, this stillness, this calmness in Blake's demeanor, seemed almost like weakness. But what he failed to understand at first was that discipline didn't require fast action. It required consistent action, day in and day out, no matter how long it took or how uncomfortable it became.
Reynolds had seen countless soldiers in combat, brave, bold, and often reckless, but they were always reacting.
Always chasing the next move, the next opportunity.
And there was a time and place for that.
But what he had never truly encountered was a soldier who was so grounded in their resolve, so committed to their duty, that they could remain unwavering, regardless of what was thrown at them. This is where Sergeant Blake's discipline came into full view.
When Reynolds finally saw beyond the surface, he realized that Blake wasn't simply standing there because he had to, he was standing there because he chose to.
Every day, every hour, every minute, Blake was choosing to hold his ground, to embody a deep sense of purpose. And that purpose wasn't just about following orders. It was about something far greater, maintaining a connection to history, to tradition, to his comrades, and to the responsibility that came with being a Royal Guard.
Here's the thing: Reynolds was accustomed to seeing the world in black and white.
In his world, you either acted or you didn't. You either made the move, or you risked losing everything.
But Sergeant Blake's world wasn't black and white.
It was about the grayscale, the space between action and inaction, where every moment was a decision to stay strong in the face of uncertainty, where every second was a test of one's commitment to a greater cause.
And that's where the true strength of Blake's discipline lay, not in the act of standing still, but in the choice to remain still when everything inside of you is screaming to do otherwise.
This was the turning point for Captain Reynolds, the moment when he realized that true strength wasn't always about charging into battle or making a bold statement. Sometimes, the greatest strength lay in holding steady, in refusing to break under pressure, in letting go of the need for immediate action and instead allowing time to do its work. Let's take a real-world example of this. In sports, athletes sometimes face moments when their training tells them to push harder, to move faster, to get to the finish line first. But great athletes, like seasoned marathon runners, understand that not all progress is measured by speed. Sometimes, the most disciplined athletes are the ones who can pace themselves, who know when to conserve energy, when to slow down and remain steady. This approach, though often counterintuitive, often leads to the greatest success. In a sense, Sergeant Blake's discipline was a marathon, not a sprint.
And Captain Reynolds, in that pivotal moment, began to understand that lesson ... As Reynolds absorbed this, his view of Blake and of discipline itself shifted. He wasn't just looking at a guard standing in place anymore.
He was looking at a man who had mastered the art of restraint, who understood the power of holding his ground even when the world seemed to demand immediate action. The turning point wasn't just a shift in Reynolds' perception of Blake. It was a shift in how he saw the very concept of discipline, and how it could be applied not only in the military, but in life.
And this is where the story takes us into deeper waters.
Because once Reynolds saw beyond the surface, he began to see the larger picture, the one that connected the values of discipline with something even more profound. But what happens when someone challenges your beliefs?
What happens when you have to reconcile two different worlds, two completely different understandings of duty and discipline?
That's the story we dive into next. Stay with me. As Captain Reynolds stood there, reflecting on everything he had just witnessed, he began to understand something crucial. The worlds of ceremony and combat, those seemingly worlds apart, were, in many ways, two sides of the same coin. On the surface, they appeared to be in opposition, one focused on showmanship, the other on raw, unrelenting force. But the truth was far more nuanced. In the world of combat, soldiers are taught to respond to threats with immediate action. They train for chaos, for unpredictability, and for the sudden rush of adrenaline. Their lives often depend on their ability to make decisions in the blink of an eye, to react swiftly to danger. It's a world where action is everything, where hesitation could cost you your life. Yet, in the world of ceremony, especially in roles like the Royal Guard, everything seems slower, more deliberate. There's no rush, no immediate danger. The guards are expected to stand still, to maintain an unwavering presence, regardless of what's going on around them. The discipline required to do so is a different kind of strength, one that isn't always immediately visible, but is incredibly powerful in its own right. Think about it for a moment. In combat, the ability to act decisively and boldly can make all the difference. But what about when there's no immediate threat? What about when the pressure is not on the battlefield, but in the heart? That's where ceremony comes in. It's the practice of standing firm even when the world seems to demand something else. It's about cultivating patience, endurance, and a deeper connection to purpose, values that are just as important in combat as they are in ceremonial roles. Sergeant Blake's discipline, that unyielding silence, was a reflection of a strength of character that Reynolds had never fully appreciated before. It wasn't just about looking strong in the face of danger, it was about standing with purpose, unshaken, in a world that often feels impatient and quick to move.
And when you can do that, when you can remain unshaken in your values and your purpose, You carry that strength into every aspect of your life, whether on the battlefield or in daily decisions. In fact, many of the most elite military units around the world, including special forces, place a heavy emphasis on mental discipline and the ability to endure discomfort, uncertainty, and stillness. It's not just about fighting harder.
It's about staying grounded, staying focused, and being able to perform when the situation calls for precision, control, and calmness.
Here's an example. Think of a sniper in a combat zone.
It's not just about having perfect aim, it's about waiting. The sniper may spend hours, even days, in silence, observing the target, waiting for the right moment.
That is a kind of strength that doesn't come from charging forward. It comes from the ability to stay still, to remain vigilant, and to trust in your training and your purpose, even when every instinct tells you to move.
This is where ceremony and combat find their common ground. Both require a deep understanding of timing, control, and self-mastery. In ceremony, you must endure long hours of standing still, holding your position no matter how uncomfortable it becomes.
In combat, you must endure the silence and tension before action is required, holding your position until the moment is right.
The lesson here is clear. Strength is not only about action. It is just as much about endurance, about standing firm, about maintaining your composure under any circumstance.
Whether in combat or in ceremony, the core principle remains the same. True strength lies in resilience.
For Reynolds, this was a profound realization.
He had always equated strength with action.
But what he now understood was that true strength often lies in the pause, in knowing when to wait, when to be patient, and when to let the situation unfold. Sometimes, standing still can be the most powerful thing you can do.
So, whether you're in the heat of battle or standing guard at the Tower of London, both roles require a commitment to a greater purpose, and both call for a mental and emotional strength that transcends action. Ceremony and combat are not opposites, they are partners, each teaching valuable lessons about the importance of patience, discipline, and unwavering resolve.